This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan podcast. This Vayikra series will focus on the lived experience of mitzvah observance, and we'll be asking some of the hard questions about Torah observant life through the prism of the mitzvot that appear in the book of Vayikra. What happens when they feel far removed from our lives? How can we understand the relationship between the written and oral law? How are certain laws actually being observed across the Jewish world? In what areas are people finding meaning today and less so in others in their Torah life? These are just some of the issues that we will be addressing in the coming episodes. Before turning to today's conversation, I wanted to remind you that sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor one of our Vayikra episodes. Parshat Shmini opens with the completion of the Kohanim's inauguration, which comes to a traumatic culmination with the deaths of Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu. Immediately after their deaths, the Kohanim are warned about several laws, some in regard to the immediate prohibition for mourning their deaths, and others more broad prohibitions like no drinking on the job. All these stipulations have been mined throughout the centuries as possible sources of Nadav and Avihu's sin. This parsha also includes the laws of Kashrut, which really straddles the two worlds or the two sides of Tum'ah, both that they carry an impurity with them, as well as an actual prohibition, something that we are simply not allowed to do. In past years, when we devoted many episodes to sort of defining the concepts of Tumah and Tahara and Kedusha, we spent a long time sort of differentiating between different kinds of Tumah, and Kashrut famously really straddles both of these worlds. It carries some sort of tainting, some sort of abomination, but it also is a prohibition that we keep even when we are living in a world where we're no longer stringent about the laws of impurity. Today I welcome a new partner in conversation, Rabbanit Dena Freundlich, who's a core member of the faculty at Midrashet Lindenbaum in Yerushalayim, where she teaches Talmud and Halakha, in addition to coordinating their Matmidot Scholars program. Prior to making Aliyah, she serves as the Talmud Department Chair at Ma'ayanot Yeshiva High School in New Jersey. Dena, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's not so often that on the podcast we sort of get to go into the weeds of, I would say, more Torah Sheba'al Peh topics. So I'm excited for this conversation because I also think it's going to bring something a little bit different than what we often end up doing in these conversations. And while our conversation today is going to also get to certain details regarding Halakhic Kashrut, which I hope will be relevant, for people's lives and give them a little bit of insight specifically into waiting between meat and milk, we kind of wanted to start with a meta question that's going to address what really is the series theme about mitzvah observance and really the complex way that mitzvot kind of have been formed over the centuries. So why don't we jump into the famously 3 times repeated lo tavashel gedi b'chalev imo, that we have this idea that you can't, if we can even translate it, that you can't cook, right, the baby goat in the milk of its mother, which somehow from there becomes a whole other thing that I want you to bring us into that space.
Absolutely. Yes, because in my teaching in general, even when I'm not teaching specifically Halakhic Kashrut, I very, very often use specifically this example of Lo Tvashel Gedi B'chalev Imo as a great example of where, if we were just reading the Torah in a vacuum, I think most of us would read that pasuk and just think, oh, God is trying to teach us compassion. Like, what a gruesome idea to cook a baby animal in the very milk that was meant to nurture its life. And now we're like cooking it in that very milk. Like, I think a lot of us would just think, oh, this is a mitzvah by which God is trying to teach us compassion. And we would never in a million years think, oh, this means I can't have a cheeseburger, or I don't know, whatever else, that I can't have any meat with any milk, even if it's not a goat, even if it's not its mother.
But it also shows up originally after the Egel story, right? Meaning it shows up there. Yes. And while it's after a mention of like a mention of all the chagim, of all of our holidays, which we feel is like a reinitiation of Am Yisrael Yisrael into the world of mitzvot after we've sort of been like allowed re-entry, it's not that our first exposure to this pasuk is in the laws of kashrut. So that's
right. Oh, it's
also
actually very
significant.
interesting. In fact, I just feel like I need to point out, even though it gets mentioned 3 times, none of them are actually in our parsha of Shmini.
Yeah.
But Shmini does talk a lot about kashrut, and I feel like most of the aspects of kashrut about like which types of animals are kosher is just not relevant in our daily lives, just in the sense of when we go to the supermarket or the butcher, like all they have there is only the kosher meat. So we don't have to decide, oh, is this slab of meat from a kosher animal or not? So basar b'chalav, meat and milk, is what's relevant in our kitchens, because in our kitchens we have both meat and milk. We don't have, a pig running around and then we have to decide, can I slaughter that and eat it?
Exactly.
But I did feel like I need to put it out there that lo teshach
not
is 3 times, but
parsha.
not actually in our parsha.
Exactly. So what do we do with the pasuk? How do we go from this sort of natural assumption that it's possibly about compassion to how does it get molded halachically?
So basically what happens is that the Gemara addresses this question of, why does it get repeated 3 times? And it basically ends up saying that one of the 3 is to teach about not cooking meat and milk together, which is sort of what the pshat meaning of the words lo tevashel. But then the other 2, one is for not getting any benefit and one is for not eating them together. So that's kind of how it gets to being a whole broad prohibition against ever eating any meat and any milk together. And then there's other derivations that explain how do we get from a goat to all animals, and meaning that there are derivations that explain each step along the way of how we get to the broad prohibition against any meat with any milk. What I personally am like more interested in, and often use this as an example, as I said, even when teaching other halacha classes, is I happen to think that this is a great example where even when learning the specific sugyot about how do we get from this phrase in the Torah to what we do, I'll say, I don't find it so compelling. Like, I don't think that I read that I'm like, oh, of course. Oh, now that's exactly, of course, that's so obvious. That's what God meant. And so to me, I think it's a great, almost like a launching off point to sort of address what I think is actually a much broader question when actually learning any halacha. I just think this is a particularly powerful and clear example of it, of what do we do when the pshat, the simple meaning of what seems to be written in the Torah, seems to be a very far cry from the way that it's interpreted. And even when, say, they'll explain the Gemara how they get from A to B, it's not always the most compelling. It's not always like after we read it that we think, oh, of course, now it's so obvious. Why didn't I think of that or realize that? Sometimes it's still like, really? That's how we got there? That's still not what I would have thought. How do we understand that experience? Why are we still bound to observe the halachot in the way that Chazal derive it, even when sometimes it doesn't seem super compelling or what we would have thought God meant by that pasuk in the Torah?
People who are listening, we have those maybe who have deep knowledge and background in Gemara learning, and even those who may have very rudimentary knowledge. If you open up any page of Gemara, you are going to find a derivation that you think, maybe, meaning that dissonance between the logic and the tools used by Chazal, and if we're already putting it in human categories, interesting, because I may not have assumed that. I may not have assumed that an extra letter means that thing. And so, first of all, there's as we said, this is like a specific example regarding kashrut, but you're touching on things that are completely universal when it comes to the halachic world. That just open up any page of Gemara, and that kind of dissonance, if someone's honest with themselves, kind of like hits you in the face.
Yes, 100%.
That's piece number one. So once we have that dissonance and we have this idea that we do want to create some sort of bridge between, these psukim and the way the halakha develops. So what do we do with that? Meaning, what do we do both with the dissonance and itself how do we look at the way the halakha is anchored in the psukim?
Excellent. So the way that I see it, I think there's 2 fundamental approaches that go all the way back, certainly to the earliest Rishonim, maybe even prior to that, and certainly continuing literally throughout the ages, continuing like ad hayom hazeh, like through the modern time. Meaning this debate is still like being hotly, discussed, and there's no clear answer. But in my mind, the 2 fundamental approaches are to basically either say that really, really all of halacha and all of the details of halacha, not even just the big category, but all of the details of halacha, were really given by God to Moshe and passed down through Masorah, and therefore it's basically irrelevant whether we find any particular derivation compelling or not, because it's not actually really the source. So it doesn't really matter whether or not lo tvashel gedi b'chalei v'imo is compelling to say that it means you can't even have a cheeseburger and, all of the far way that it's taken, because really it's that God told Moshe, I'm telling you, Moshe, tell the children of Israel, like, they can't have cheeseburgers, they can't have any meat and milk. In my Torah, I'm writing just this phrase of lo tvashel gedi b'chalei v'imo, but it really, the source of it is not actually starting from the pasuk and then deriving from it. The source really is God told Moshe. So that's one approach.
It reads against, I don't know, most of the Gemara, I feel like. Meaning, when you read the Gemara, your impression isn't that we are having pretend conversations because we already know the end game.
Exactly.
That is not I think, a coherent read of most of the Talmudic discourse.
Excellent.
And also goes against some of our big famous stories of Tonu Rosh Halachanai, which
good.
maybe
Excellent.
we give it too much authority to say Lo B'Shamayim, maybe we take that story too far. I don't know. But the idea that, we have a lot more human agency in this world than that. I don't even understand how that position is really founded.
Excellent. So I do want to get to the second position, which will more go with like the Tanor Shalachnai Gemara. But even before turning there, I think that there would be two ways that people in the first camp would approach this question about Gemara. Well, so first of all, I'll just share my own personal thoughts that as somebody who loves Gemara, I agree with you. That is why I personally have to admit that I'm in the second camp, largely because this first approach basically does turn the Gemara into a big b'diavad that really, let me back up for a second. To answer your question about the Gemara and the fact that all of the Gemara, it really does sort of turn the Gemara into almost this like fake
news.
discussion.
It's fake news.
Yes, it's fake news. We really knew. So the answer is that the way in which it's not really fully fake news is that we messed up. Meaning, you're exactly right. That approach has to address, well, then why is every single page of Gemara full of machloket? Like, there shouldn't be any machloket.
Exactly. It's all about recovering the lost source.
Exactly.
I don't like it.
I agree with you. I'm also not in that camp. However, so let me even just to defend that position for a minute. The huge defense of that position is that it gives tremendous authority and divinity and authenticity to halacha. That really God wants this. He wants every single detail. He told every detail. Like, it might sometimes feel like, I don't know, when making tea on Shabbos, does it really matter if I use this Kosh Shlishi or not? Or whatever? And this answer says, yes, God on Mount Sinai told Moshe Kli Shlishi, or whatever other example you want to use. It gives a lot of divinity and authenticity and meaningfulness, and that really, yes, God cares about every detail. That's the huge, I think, draw and pro, so to speak, of that approach. The downside is that then why is every page of Gemara full of machloket? And that position, it's actually a Gemara that expresses that really in the beginning there was not actually a lot of machloket, and that there's a famous Gemara that says that only when the students of Hillel and Shammai, Lo Shimshu Kol Tzarkan, they didn't do Shema, sort of, they didn't really learn properly and sufficiently, then machloket sort of proliferated. But point being, that approach does view machloket as a b'diavad, as something that had we humans done our job properly, there wouldn't have been machloket, there wouldn't have been a Gemara. We wouldn't have needed this whole intense endeavor to like recapture and refigure out what God already said. Basically, all of halacha would have just looked like a Shulchan Aruch or a Rambam. It would have just been a very clear list of do's and don'ts without all the back and forth. As somebody who loves the machloket and the back and forth and the whatever is why I don't put myself in that camp, but I understand its draw.
Just to add one other layer of nuance, to not in defensive, but I think just like a slight additional level of sophistication, because there are also approaches in the Rishonim who look at this kind of idea and say it's that they don't necessarily go as far to say that there shouldn't have been machloket, but that each of the different opinions in your average debate in the Gemara all reflect a certain refraction of the truth. Meaning that's an approach. I feel like I want to bring it in the name of the Chida, but I'm not sure if that's correct. But that you have this idea that it's not that there shouldn't have been anything that was a machloket. No, of course you have to have sort of to duke it out, to figure out what the exact details are. because it's a little bit of a stretch, Gene. I think you would agree to say that God spoke to Moshe about koshlishi, meaning about this idea of having to make tea in a special way, from the urn to the extra cup to the extra cup, but this approach, I think, is like a little bit more of a bridge, which says that when trying to figure out how the law needs to develop, each of the opinions contain a certain element of this divine truth to them. So it lives in parallel, I think, with this idea, and like takes it, maybe it brings it up a slight level, I think, in terms of like sophistication. It could be like a bridge. It could be some sort of bridge between them.
Correct.
Okay, but what about our second camp?
Yes. So the second camp, first of all, I want to be clear, even the second camp definitely agrees that there is such a thing as halacha l'moshe miSinai, and that there definitely are some elements of Torah Sheba'al Peh that were directly given by God to Moshe and passed down through Masorah. But the second camp says not everything was given that way, that there were some aspects of Torah Sheba'al Peh that God basically gave Moshe this, I think, a tremendous gift, and invited Moshe and subsequent, human beings even after Moshe, meaning it wasn't just for Moshe, and basically that God reached out his hands in partnership, I think, to Moshe and to other human beings after him to partner with God in the creative creation of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, again, not just creative, you could do whatever you want with it, but basically said, here are certain rules of the game and rules of the system, and that God basically gave certain aspects. Again, some is halacha l'moshe miSinai, but the second camp says there are aspects and elements where we really didn't know the answer. We didn't know what the halacha was supposed to be. And yes, human beings were sitting around in the Beit Midrash, figuring it out and duking it out and debating, and they don't know the answer, and they're really figuring it out and determining halacha, not just because something was forgotten and now they're trying to re-get it, like from the get-go.
Right, there's a creation.
Yes,
there's a creation element here.
Yes,
Some names we could put to that approach. Rav Yosef Albo writes something related in his Yid Gimel Ikarim, in his 13 principles, and also the Ramban writes something related, and also Rav Eliezer Berkovitz, who that's not going to be utterly surprising, because he's definitely a more pluralistically minded and humanly minded modern poseg, or modern authority and thinker. But what's interesting, I think what's the advantages and disadvantages of this approach are relatively clear. Meaning the advantage is that it seems to fit much better, first of all, with the reality of the Gemara, with some of our sort of like iconic or canonical stories like Tona Rosh Lachnai, that the Torah is lo b'shamayim hi. The point is, even if there might be some objective divine truth of what actually was true in that story, God goes with the humanly defined truth. And in addition to that, I think that that this is something that also creates a tremendous degree of human agency, meaning where we, as you said, we're here to be partners with God. And I think that, yes, from a rational perspective, this definitely works better for a lot of people. The downside is that you may prepare your tea with a koshlishi and you don't feel that you're doing God's will. And I think that that's a real thing,
Yes.
I grew up in a home, by the way, if I could just mention my father, Alav Shalom, where I think at some point when I started using like Shabbat toothpaste, right, which for those, just to clarify for everybody, it's sort of like a thinner, more watery kind of toothpaste, so that you're not doing a malacha called memareach, you're not sort of like smearing your toothpaste. And I remember him, I love my father, and he was a very God-fearing, and I would say a God-loving heretic. That's how he described himself. And he's like, God doesn't care about your toothpaste, right? These are voices that you can't quell. I'm just saying, when you grow up with them, they're very strong voices. And I think that that's a real thing, because there's a certain kind of fervor that you can have when it comes to details of halacha, when you feel that God gave this to you.
100%. Again, that's the benefit of the first way.
Exactly.
But I think that the way that the second approach would respond is, and I really feel this way very deeply, that God wants us to keep every detail of halacha. Even means to me, that's the beauty of the Tana Shalachnai Gemara, is even if and when there's a case where God might be thinking, that's not what I meant. I actually meant halacha to like go in this other direction. But that what God cares about even more than reaching halakhic truth with a capital T, as what he kivyachol like had in mind, so to speak, like from the get-go, God wants us to follow the halakhic system as the rabbis determine it. So that, again, really Tanur Shalchnai is like the champion Gemara of this approach, where God is like smiling and saying, my sons have vanquished me at the end of that Gemara, that God does actually care about us observing even the minutia details of halacha, even if and when the minutia of halacha, meaning it's not necessarily about that specific detail. He might actually have, again, Kiviyachol had in mind something else. Yeah. But once the rabbis determined this is how we, interpreted what God wants, even if they got it wrong, I very much believe God then very much does care that we stay faithful to and committed to and observe the system as it is.
I just want to just read 2 lines from an essay of Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz. And I just wanted to read a quote from Rav Eliezer Berkovitz's essay called Not in Heaven, The Nature and Function of Halacha, which is in his collected essays, which is a book I kind of sleep next to at night. Also belonged to my father, Alav Shalom. And he says the following. He says, I believe that we may say that halacha is the wisdom of the application of the written word of the Torah to the life and history of the Jewish people. No written word can deal in advance with the innumerable situations, changes of circumstances, and new developments that normally occur in the history of men and nations. And so he says that the need for this has been clearly felt over the generations. The eternal word of the Torah required a time-related teaching in order to become effective in life for the Jewish people. And this was a tradition that was passed on by the living word from generation to generation, the Torah Shebaal Peh. He really places tremendous emphasis on the human element in the system, and you see different, slightly varied approaches throughout the generations. Those who say it's mostly human system, but it's guided by divine wisdom, or it's mostly, right? So he's really on the full side of human wisdom, but you see sort of different variations of it in accordance with what we said is this slight discomfort with when you get to the end game, you sort of are left with, okay, so I'm using a lot of cups because someone told me that and decided that in the Talmudic period. And you're saying, according to this approach, the answer is yes, meaning that was what was decided and they have that invested authority. And of course, it opens up the other can of worms of, well, what happens in the generations after when they make other decisions? And I don't know if we want to go there today, but it opens up this general question about the Halakhic order and the way the halacha develops over time.
Right. Though in general, once something is concluded in the Gemara, generally then, like it's sort of,
we take
like,
that principle.
Untouchable.
Exactly. What we can do is utilize those principles to then shift with a current situation that's different. Meaning, just to clarify also, it's just like, I guess we're doing an introduction to halacha class today, but meaning what we can do later on in the period of the Geonim, and then as we continue on with Achronim, etc., is that we can take the principles that we already have decided upon with their strictures and then apply them to new scenarios. But we tend not to create new concepts. So we work with the same rules and apply them to different situations.
Yes. Also, by the way, I want to add that in this second approach, where exactly as you're saying, the downside is sometimes it then can feel like man-made and not divine, and then does it really matter? But something that I think is brilliant about the system is that even, say, within that second approach, given as I made sure to emphasize in the beginning, even that second approach definitely agrees there are some things that are halacha Moshe Sinai. Yes. And what I think is brilliant is that we don't know which is which. So I happen to think that there are certain sugyot of the Gemara that from which it seems between the lines you can kind of tell, because in some sugyot it's clear that they kind of know what the answer is. Like I always use the example of ayin tachat ayin, where it's clear they know it's money. They're not really debating is it literal or not. They know that it's money, and then the only debate is what's the legitimate source for getting there, but they know the target, so to speak. Whereas in contrast, Yehareg Val Ya'avor, when do you live and when do you die? This is fundamental.
For a mitzvah.
Yes, exactly. Meaning if somebody holds a gun to your head and says, eat this cheeseburger, to go back to Kashrut, right, or I'm going to kill you, how do we know that you should eat the cheeseburger? Versus if they say, bow to an idol, how do you know that you should die rather than bow to the idol? There, it's fascinating. The sugya starts with them taking a vote. They don't know the answer. And that is such a big question. And even after they take the vote and decide, as is famously known, that the 3 and the only 3 that you have to die rather than, violate is for idol worship and sexual immorality and murder, there's a dissenting opinion there who says, no, I don't agree with that list. Point being, to me, just from reading the sugyot, ayin tachat ayin seems like they had a tradition, they had a misorah, they knew it's really money, and yet by, when do you have to live or die, the clear sense from the sugya is they're not starting knowing the answer. They're literally figuring it out and taking a vote and debating. And it's not like one of those is big and important and fundamental and one is a detail. Those are both like big things. Yeah. Anyway, but even though I think that those are good examples where from like really reading between the lines of the sugya, for example, like I think you can kind of get a sense of in one they knew and in one not. But by most things, we don't really know which is which. And I actually think that's the brilliance. Meaning, and actually, I even have like a list of things that are explicit in the Gemara, Shmini Sinai.
I wanted to ask you,
does
someone have a list?
Yes.
You have a list.
I didn't compile it myself, but I do have one.
But I just want to clarify, because what you're saying is that we have multiple places in the Talmudic commentaries where it says that something is a law that Moshe received from Sinai, right? Halakha Moshe Sinai. But it seems to be, as you're saying, that is not the composite list, meaning that there seem to be other ideas that sit at the root that are clearly an idea that they know that there's no debate about it. And so what you're theorizing is that this should be on the list of what seems to be part of the core teaching that maybe didn't get that official title, but it seems to be that it's on that list, right?
Exactly. And again, the first approach would put everything on that list.
Yeah.
The second approach would agree with that list, which are things which are explicit in the Gemara, that the Gemara calls Halakha Moshe Sinai. But I think everybody, even the second approach, would agree that there are more things on the list. And what I think is brilliant is because we don't really fully know. Again, the first approach will put everything on that list. Right. The second approach says some yes, some not, but because we don't know what yes, what not, on any given halacha, and my point is when you look at the list of things that the Gemara explicitly says are Halakha Moshe Sinai, a lot of them are like minutia of details that you would never think if God is going to like cherry pick just a few halachot to explicitly tell Moshe, this is not like what I would have thought.
Right.
But point being, if even those were, then it opens up the whole question of point being on any specific halacha, therefore, if somebody is feeling like, I don't know, is this really divine? Is this really what God intended? Does God really care about my toothpaste or whatever? The answer is maybe this was one of those things that God actually did explicitly tell Moshe. And even the second approach, we don't ever really know which is which.
You're saying by leaving it as an open mystery, it actually raises the possibility that all these many different matters can be sort of part of the core teaching, and that by not revealing that completely, it actually becomes one of the strengths of the system.
Exactly. And what I think is brilliant is that blurred line, that unclarity, is like so brilliantly able to therefore preserve both human involvement and the divine authenticity, because on any given halacha or detail, we don't know which it is. And therefore God was able to both make room for human involvement and yet still preserve that sense of, yes, God does care about every detail, because on any particular detail, we don't know which one it is, whether this was one of the ones that was derived through human creativity or was directly given by God to Moshe.
If I continue to play just a minor devil's advocate, or just be, the average student listening to this, so I would say that where it leaves room for this question of, does God really care, is in the halachot that are defined as the Rabbanan, meaning halachot that are defined as rabbinically enacted, created, whatever the word is. It still leaves that space open for these questions of was that really the intention? But I think according to the second approach, if taken to its full end, the answer really has to be, at a certain point, the buck stops. And it really, you cannot claim that that's what God intended, but that is part of the system. And if you submit yourself to the system, then you submit yourself to the system of Rabbanan as well.
Yes.
But I just want to say, both of us being educators who also educate in the world of halakha, we know that sometimes more knowledge for people isn't necessarily better, right? Meaning if we're
some and some,
meaning I want to hear what you have to say. I'm saying we know, but I'm asking you. Meaning sometimes knowing what's sort of openly rabbinic and what is Doraita from the Torah, or possibly, from even more clearly divine source than that. Sometimes it's helpful for people to know, so that if they're already going to make decisions, they'll make decisions that are slightly more judicious. But sometimes for sort of a completely halachically observant individual, sometimes knowing those differences can sometimes feel to them undermining. I'm just reflecting back thoughts that I've heard reflected, and I can imagine in my own life as well, meaning this idea that sometimes people don't really want to know, and they really want to take seriously the fact that they have two completely different sinks that never should touch each other, and it doesn't matter if it's cold or hot. Please don't tell me if it's cold or hot. It makes me confused and I don't want to know, right? Meaning for some people that's powerful for them, and for other people they really do want to know because they want to know, how they can shift in certain spaces, or be careful when they need to and not careful when they don't need to.
I definitely hear both sides. It's so funny. I was literally just this week discussing this with my brother. I happen to just personally be very strongly on the side of education, and like that people should know, and that ironically, even though sometimes the argument behind not telling people is so that then they'll just like keep everything, intensively and in a committed way and not make distinctions or treat it less seriously, so to speak, if they know it's quote unquote only Rabbanan. But I don't know. I feel like, number one, just in a pure whatever way, I just feel like, but people should know. But secondly, I just feel like often that can be what leads to actually more mistakes, because then people don't know how to make appropriate decisions, or are too machmir when they really don't have to be, and when it actually can lead to like difficult or painful situations, whether involving a kibbut avim or who knows what. So both just in a purest kind of a way, because I believe in education and knowledge. But even not just that, even just from the purely taking into account practicality and what will keep people most committed and keeping halacha properly. Again, I definitely hear both sides, but I'm definitely in the camp of
I'm
more
going to say
education.
something that I may edit out later, but I may not. And so if I keep that in, you'll know how I'm conflicted about saying it. But I think that in a lot of these questions, and again, you and I teach like a certain cross-section of society that are related to each other. And I find that with people who pride themselves in being intelligent people, they feel that knowledge is always empowering. And for other people, either educated differently or with, I would say, slightly lesser intellectual capacities, they do not always necessarily find that to be the case. There are some people who are deeply strengthened by just being given a clear instruction without too many details. And what gives them strength is following that to its end. I agree with you. I live in that space. I definitely want to educate that way. But when you kind of meet people from all different sections of life, you kind of realize that some people really, really don't operate that way. And they really don't want to know the distinctions. It's more powerful for them when it has a certain degree of simplicity to it. And so I don't have any criticism of it. I just want to like put it on the table for a minute that like you and I probably emerged from a related space, and like we teach in a way that's relatively related. But I've been fascinated throughout my life up until this point to meet so many people who really don't function that way. And they kind of want to just see it all as like one big grouping, and they don't really want to know the details. I agree with you. On a halakhic level, it brings people to many mistakes. And if somebody's overwhelmed by the system, it would behoove them to know the differences between things so that they can make decisions. But lots of times people don't function that way.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. I think also what, though, always worries me a little bit about that approach, even though I totally agree, and there are many people who that it not just works for, but who are like genuinely like deep, like emunah pshuta almost is like the term that comes to mind in a very beautiful way. What sometimes concerns me is that if everything though is just sort of painted with one, broad stroke, then it also sometimes can lead, besides for potentially making wrong halakhic decisions in one's own life, but sometimes can even therefore sometimes lead to like judgmentalness on people who are making other halakhic decisions, because it turns everything into such clear black and white of like, this is what God wants and that's not. So then if you see somebody doing the thing that you were just sort of told is not, and you weren't really told the back and forth behind it, and that there actually are legitimate people who think the other way, it just also, I think, sometimes can lead to, therefore, like judgmentalness on people, like, because it becomes so not really part of the discussion that there actually is a legitimate other way.
Yeah, it makes it monolithic in a way.
It makes it monolithic, and it makes people relate to those who are doing the non-monolithic way. Yeah. Like,
I guess we could be honest and say that some institutions like that kind of approach because they want people to be inside and to be judgmental of another space. Meaning there's like so many sides to this conversation, right? Like sometimes institution will want to put forward an idea as if it is clearly the only halakhic position so that they can try and convince as many of their students as they can. And then look down on others who might choose differently. I think that there's I don't agree with that educational approach either. I'm just saying that I think
maybe.
that
I would hope that it's coming from a place of not hopefully wanting their students to be judgmental, but just wanting their students to be passionately committed and to doing what they think is the right things. I think that's the main motivation. And again, I respect that. I guess it's just something I think to be careful about and again, in our way, definitely has its drawbacks that we need to be careful about as well.
If I can bring us back to our conversation, as we sort of will transition into some more conversations about Kashrut itself, if we sort of summarize with this question of, well, how do we know that Chazal got it right, so to speak? So what's our response to that?
In terms of
the approaches that we brought,
meaning vis-a-vis specifically, basar b'chalav and cheeseburgers, is so in terms of what that would mean practically. So again, if we go the first way, it means that God told Moshe on Har Sinai all the details of Kashrut and whatever it is, and we can go back to the Gemara and see all the derivations, but again, it's somewhat irrelevant. Really, God told it to Moshe. And in the second way would mean that some of the aspects, I actually even went through it, the sugya about basar b'chalav, and trying to even pick out where do we see that there's machloket and where do we see not, because where there's no machloket seems to be a good indication that probably then there was some misora about it, because otherwise, why is there no debate about it, if it's not a black and white straight thing? Anyway, so I actually happen to have gone through this again about basar b'chalav, trying to pick out those. And bottom line is, it seems that there's somewhere there's no machloket, and that really seems to be that there was some mosaic divine from God to whatever tradition, and some it really seems like they didn't know and they're debating it and they're figuring it out. But again, whichever way it is, no matter what, that we would be bound to keep it. But
it's not because quote unquote they necessarily got it 100% right.
Correct.
Because we're giving them the human agency, and that's where we come to with this piece.
Exactly. I personally am open to that possibility that maybe on some things it wasn't what God had in mind, but even so, once they come to that conclusion, God wants us to follow that conclusion.
So before we go into a specific halachic detail in the world of Kashrut, I kind of just wanted to take a step back for a moment and sort of speak about why Kashrut. Now, why do we have this whole stipulation? Now, to be honest, maybe it's just because I'm somebody who's so deep in the system. To me, I kind of would ask myself, why not? Meaning, if the Torah is relegating and has all these stipulations about all aspects of life, obviously it's going to have something about the way we eat. Meaning, it's such a central way that humans function. So, I guess, but that's just to reflect the fact that I'm too deep in the system. But if we take a step back for a second and ask why, so what are some of the approaches that we've seen throughout the ages?
Yeah. So again, first of all, just always important to state, and Yeshayahu Leibowitz, who, interestingly, posthumously, his sister Nechama Leibowitz has, I think, certainly at least among American Jewry, become by far the more famous of the Leibowitz siblings. Yeah. But interestingly, when they were alive, Yeshayahu Leibowitz was very, very well known, especially here in Israel.
Yeah, in Israel, his legacy still lives on.
Yeah. Anyway, he was a huge proponent of the idea of not looking for reasons for mitzvot at all, and basically just saying that all mitzvot are really to demonstrate our subservience to God. And the second that we look for a reason and think it's good for me, say just taking Shabbos, for example, for a second, it's good for me because it's good for family time, it's good to disconnect from technology once a week. Well, then you're doing it for yourself and you're not doing it for God.
He called it idolatry, actually.
Yes,
he called it idolatry.
He's really harif.
He was a very iconoclastic figure who wasn't, there were a lot of different opinions about him throughout the time. He kind of was today what we would call troll, but before that phrase was used, meaning he always presented an opinion that was just diametrically opposed to what most people were thinking. But they're really important opinions because they often help people, even if they don't agree with what he says, to really help crystallize what they believe.
Yes.
Yeah, his writings are fantastic, honestly. Even if I don't agree with a lot of them, but they're fantastic.
Yeah. Anyway, so just always feel it's important to put that out there, that there is this idea about don't look for reasons. Yeah. But if we are going to look for reasons, and what I just always think is cool about that debate is, according to his approach, if you look for reasons, it's not just not a good idea, but then, he even calls it idolatry, and then you're serving yourself and not serving God. Yeah. What's interesting is that the opposite approach and the opposite extreme would say, if you don't look for reasons, then you're missing the whole point of mitzvot, that it's not even the middle ground would be to say, look for reasons that'll make it more meaningful. But the extreme would say, God doesn't just want us to be robots or automatons just sort of blindly doing the actions he commanded. He gave us certain commandments and demanded certain actions in order to teach us certain ideas. And if we don't look for why and what's God trying to teach me and what's he trying to inculcate into me, if we don't ask those questions and try to derive the meaning behind it, then we're like missing the whole point. The point isn't to just be this robotic person like eating these foods and not those foods. The point is to actually ask why and what am I supposed to learn and what am I supposed to like gain from this in terms of the ideas and how it's supposed to impact me. So it's just cool that there's like very diametrically opposed ideas on this question. Yeah. Within those who are going to look for reasons for mitzvot, there are several different schools of thought about it. So the Rambam very famously, for example, thinks it's all about health, which is pretty wild. And so there definitely were those who levied some pretty strong attacks on that idea. Like the Abarbanel, for example, really is like very against that idea.
Even in those times, they said there doesn't seem to be great proof for that idea. Today, we would say there's really no proof for that idea, meaning we understand why he went in those directions. Health was thankfully a prominent idea for the Rambam, and many of his ideas have proven to be very worthy throughout the generations. But this one in particular doesn't seem to be. And if there did seem to be something that he could point to, it probably was just lack of hygiene in the way that it was being, food was being prepared and consumed in those days.
Well, one of the attacks that the Abarbanel raises, which I always thought was so clever, he said, we don't even have to do a thought experiment of like, what might it look like if we weren't keeping kosher?
Right,
he says, we have the whole rest of the world, and the Jews don't actually appear to be healthier or living longer. So that's one of the, I think he brings at least 3 like strong challenges on the Rambam's idea of health. In any case, there is then, say, like another approach taken, for example, by the Ramban and by the Abarbanel himself, of saying it's about spiritual health. That makes a lot of sense in the sense that one of the Abarbanel's other attacks is how can you belittle our holy Torah to just being a medical textbook? So if you say it's about spiritual health, then that would fit with like sort of the grand, goals of the Torah. At the same time, what's difficult about that approach is how does yes or not eating a cheeseburger make us like more spiritually healthy or not? So interestingly, the Ramban suggests this idea where he says that the non-kosher birds are all birds of prey, and that there is like some cruelty that is actually literally in a physical biological way found in their blood and therefore in their flesh, and therefore if we eat those animals, that quality that is actually has some biological actual real substance to it will then go into us and we will become cruel people. Again, it's literally like you are what you eat. Again, one can question whether how accurate that is, but what we can appreciate and what he's trying to do is trying to say our holy spiritual Torah can't be about physical health, it's got to be about spiritual health, but then how do I link what I eat to spiritual health? And he's looking for some bridge between those two. Alternatively, especially in more modern times, like Shadal, for example, Shmuel David Luzzatto, who lived in Italy in the 1800s, he suggested things that probably will speak more to like the modern mind, where he speaks about basically refining our character, and that it, for example, teaches us self-control and self-restraint, and also makes us very God-conscious, that because eating is such a thing that humans do every day, all the time, every time we're eating, it makes us remember, right, like there's God and I have to eat in accordance with, what God wants from me. So he more focuses on things like that, like refining our characters in terms of teaching us self-restraint and on, sort of teaching us exactly like sort of how to think about God and training us to think about God all the time.
I think the lived experience of people keeping kashrut within Israel and outside of Israel is worth just mentioning right now, because when you're living in Israel in a relative, it's hard to go too far from a place where there are observant Jews somewhere around. Kashrut is not such a great exercise in self-restraint. Maybe when it comes to, basar v'chalav.
I was going to say, even basar v'chalav, even if every food in the whole wide world was kosher, it still teaches self-restraint.
So you do, but I'm just saying on a regular basis, it's not anywhere near. I told you before when we started recording, I just came back from a weekend in Europe where I was teaching Torah for the weekend. And it was this great reminder in that piece, it's like so restrictive, and, the excitement when, that ice cream store got, some sort of, hechsher, and I grew up like that. It was just so many decades ago. It's hard for me to remember it exactly, but like I was reminded of that experience of like that thing where like you really can't eat anywhere, and you go to these crazy, beautiful countries with 50,000 cafes in the street and, at most you're getting a coffee, So like it is a tremendous exercise in self-restraint, except that in modern Israel, we're blessed with the fact that most of the time we don't experience it that way, unless in the case of waiting between milk and meat, which we'll get to, which I also forgot about for years because I'm vegetarian for years up until in the last year. Cool. So I literally took me a little while to reacculturate. I completely forgot how to like count time between food because I spent so many years never doing it. But yeah, anyways, okay, going back. So we saw Shadel and his modern sensibilities.
And by the way, I just want to add one other piece, which he also says in the beginning, and I think it's also a huge factor that when living among or in a society with non-Jews, it is such a brilliant and effective way to just help us remember, especially say I teach in a midrashah, so most of my students are going on from spending the year by us to, secular college campuses where for many or most of them for the first time, they're going to be literally like living in dorms and being lab partners and whatever, else with non-Jews. And the fact that we have to, eat in the Hillel, and even if we're just like hanging out, having a study session, have to, make sure that our snacks are kosher, it is actually such a brilliant and effective way to just remind us that even, yes, as we have these friendships, or it could be business associates or whatever it is, like, and we can and should be friends. And it serves as, like, I think, a really powerful and constant reminder, especially because eating is one of the most social activities that we do, that, yes, we can be friends, but, like, still I have to remember that, I'm Jewish and I have my own value system and culture and rules and whatever. So I think
of course, this has been the butt of, many anti-Semitic tropes. Even just the Gemara Megillah brings an example. It brings an example of Yain Nesach, but, that to him shonot, that when Haman claims that we're different, we're also spread around, we're everywhere, so to speak, and we have different practices. So the Gemara and many other sources throughout the centuries bring what clearly was a flashpoint, which is that, we don't even eat with them. We won't even sit down with them, meaning this is something that it serves a purpose. It also, in those situations, can create sometimes a feeling of, like they're different and separate, which for us might be healthy, but on the outside doesn't always feel smooth. But
and I'll also just add that unfortunately, it sometimes also, especially whatever in modern times, creates divisions among Jews, and that's like so sad because I really don't think that was the intention. I think perhaps some of the intention was to
we won't eat with each other because they have their kashrut and they have their kashrut.
Exactly, and that's sad, but what are you going to do?
Yeah. With that overview of different approaches to kashrut, we sort of wanted to pick one issue, as we said, that's very relevant to most of our lives, that we want to sort of get a little bit more into the weeds today. Speaking of different practices among Jews, this is a great one. Yes. I actually, as I said, was just in Zurich, and the host that I was staying in, so they actually originate from Holland. So while I'm skipping to the end of what you're about to say, they wait 1 hour between, as they say, milky and meaty. But yeah, so why don't you bring us a little bit into that space? I think many people have a tremendous amount of misconceptions about this topic, because going back to our first element of our conversation, a lot of times it can feel to the external eye a little bit contrived. What do I mean? We have between 6 hours, 5 hours and a minute. We have 1 hour. There's sort of these different approaches. So I'd love for you to sort of just shine a light on this so that people can feel they have a little bit more like in their hands to take with them.
Got it. Anyway, so I always think that this is a great example where it really all stems from an ambiguity in the Gemara, and that if one learns the sugya, then it's actually like so clear where the different approaches come from. Because what actually happens is that in Masechet Chulin on Daf Kuf Hey Amud Aleph, we basically have this line, Ana laha milta chala bar chamer l'gabe Abba. He basically says, I compare it to my father. I'm like vinegar, the son of wine, like my dad was way better than me. Di ilu Abba, my father, ki hava achil bisra ha'idna, if he would eat meat now, lo hava achal gvina ad lemachar ad hashtag. Basically, he would wait 24 hours, which is crazy. Basically, that would mean that anytime you ever had meat, you would have to go an entire day after that of eating only pirate foods, because otherwise you'll just like restart your count if you have meat and you can't have milk. It's like, that's really extreme. But Mar Ukva himself says, V'ilu ana, I, who again, I'm only vinegar, the son of wine, I'm not as strict as my father. I, behasudata hu delo achilna, I, in the same meal, I would not eat meat and dairy. Lesudata achrita achilna, but in the next meal I would. And that is where this whole like Pandora's box.
How long elapses between meals in Talmudic times?
Or the truth is, it's even before that. The question is it even about what does he mean when he says, in the same meal I wouldn't eat meat and dairy, but in the next meal I would? Does he even mean an amount of time? There's a whole school of thought that is very rooted in the Rishonim and even in the Poskim, especially for Ashkenazim, as we'll see, which says it has nothing to do with an amount of time at all. All you have to do between meat and dairy is just start a new meal. Now, how does one in the world of halacha indicate that meal A is done and now I'm starting meal B? Make a bracha achrona. Like, that's it. It's really, really wild where... basically there is this whole idea within Tosfos where Tosfos basically just says, he literally, here, I'll even just read this, just one line, where he says, Ela afilu la'alter. La'alter means immediately. You don't have to wait at all. Even immediately, im silek hashulchan, meaning you have to also clear the table in order to just practically indicate that it's a new meal. Ubi reich, you have to bench or make a bracha achrona. Mutar, then it would be permissible to already, you can have your Ben and Jerry's for dessert after your steak dinner, as long as you clear the table, made a bracha achrona between them. Like,
are we assuming that that's what Tosfot did, meaning that whole school, right, of our French authorities? Do we assume that's what they did? That is a great
question about, like, bottom line, like, practically, like, what did they actually do?
We have
like,
this question on every corner of halacha when it comes to these mechlokot. This always fascinates me. They don't write, but we kind of have to assume that they probably were noheg. They probably acted that way.
I have to say, it seems to me, yes. I can't say for sure, but it seems to me, yes. And what makes it seem to me, yes, is the fact that even the Ramah of Moshe Isserlis, who's kind of like viewed as like the father of Ashkenaz Psak, basically paskins like that, which is really, really wild. Hold on, wait, I want to even just open up that piece just to see it. So is that even the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis, who's viewed as the father of Ashkenaz Psak, basically paskins like that Tosfos, where he basically says, the Yesh Omrim, there are those that say, De'ein tzrichim lamtim sheish sha'ot, you don't have to wait 6 hours, and so then we're probably thinking, oh, but he's going to say 5 or 3 or something. He says, Rak miyad. This is again the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserlis, the like major Ashkenaz posek, says immediately im silek ubirech birkat hamazon, as long as you again removed the table, cleared the table, and benched or said whatever bracha achrona is appropriate for the meal you had. Mutar li'yedei kinuach v'adachad. Then it would be permissible to have dairy, as long as again you would have to rinse your mouth a little bit, like I don't know, eat a cracker and take a drink of water. It's really, really wild. And what's crazy is that he even then goes on to say, V'haminhag ha'pashut b'medinot elu, the widespread practice in his lands, in Ashkenaz in the 1500s, was lahamtina charachilat abasar sha'achat, v'ochlin achar kach vina, was just to wait 1 hour. Like, now it's become this very few and far between. Just, the Dutch Jews have preserved this. And I think it's fascinating that the Ramah is telling us that in the 1500s, he tells us minhag pashut. That was the widespread Ashkenaz minhag, was just to wait 1 hour. And what's wild is that even waiting that 1 hour is already a chumrah. Meaning he really says you don't have to wait. You just have to clear the table and make a bracha achrona and then maybe rinse your mouth a bit and then you're good to go. Even the 1 hour was really a chumrah. In which case I was always like, well then what made it change? Why is that not widespread now? My guess is, ironically, that it's this very Ramah. Why? Because even though he goes on for actually a whole bunch more lines explaining that, he ends this, section, this paragraph where he's talking about waiting, his last line, after he just spent lines saying, you don't really have to wait at all, just clear the table and bench. And you want to be machmir, fine, just wait 1 hour. And that was the widespread practice. But his last line is, V'yesh medaktikim lahamtin sheish sha'ot achar echelat basar ligvina. There are those that are careful to wait 6 hours after having meat before having cheese, v'chein nachon la'asot. And then he adds those last 3 words of, and I think that's the appropriate thing to do. So even though his real psak is that you don't have to wait really at all, just clear the table and bench, he says the widespread practice at his time was to wait 1 hour, but then he closes by recommending 6 hours. And so I'm guessing that it's probably this very Ramah that sort of shifted the minhag.
originate here, or it's mentioned earlier?
No, so the 6, correct.
It's mentioned earlier as a time estimate of how long you have between meals.
Yes, wait, so let me even go back for a second. So all that was one approach where I'm saying that, going back to that line of the Gemara where Mar Ukva was just saying, I would just wait till the next meal. One whole approach is you don't have to wait at all. It just indicates it's the next meal. However, from already the early Rishonim is already a whole different approach, which is to say, when he says, I would wait between one meal and the next, that was his way of saying, I would wait a certain specific amount of time. Meaning the same way as all measurements in the world in the time of the Gemara are not given in like inches and centimeters the way that we talk.
Nope.
Exactly. It's like a fist, right, is a tefach, and an amma is right from your wrist till your elbow. It's like, it's all given in, a kibetza, a kizayit, an egg size, an olive size. It's all just given in even yatsoletipo, right, the temperature which your hand recoils.
In measurements that are realistic for humans to deal in, who aren't walking around with a ruler. By the way, I would just say, as a modern Jew who does own rulers and measuring sticks in her home, I still way prefer the Talmudic approach.
Totally, it's
I
much
feel
easier
very
to
scared
apply
when people start taking out inches and centimeters and start looking at lettuce under microscopes. It makes me nervous, personally. But
yeah, I totally hear that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even, for example, it's so funny because it becomes very relevant in Hilchot Kashrut, the measurement of yatsoletipo, the hand at which your hand recoils. And often I'll have a student who will say, well, what exact temperature is that? And of course, if you Google it, I'm sure you can find it. But I always say to them, like, actually having the indicator of yatsoletipo is so much more practical. Like, what are you going to do? Suddenly, like, grab a thermometer, stick it under the flow of your water, or stick it onto your chicken to see your, like, whereas yatsoletipo, did your hand recoil or didn't it?
By the way, it goes back to that same piece about objective truth versus human truth, meaning it's true that maybe your hand will recoil, Dina, slower than mine does. I'm very sensitive to temperature. Meaning it could be that yours might, but that's okay. Meaning when we move into this very rational space where we're used to measuring everything and having everything in a lab, so then we start subjecting our religion to something similar. And I don't necessarily always think that it leads to the healthiest kind of, approaches. Like, yes, there is room for human diversity in this measurement, in air quotes, of Yad Soledetbo, but it's okay. They realize that as well.
Right. Yes, I agree. In any case, and going back to our line, point being, so there were some Rishonim, like Tosos, followed by the Ramah, who say it's not about a measurement of time, it's just a different meal. However, there were other Rishonim, followed by other poskim, such as Rav Yosef Cairo and the Shulchan Aruch, who say this was Mar Ukva's way of saying an amount of time. Yeah. It's just they didn't talk in hours and minutes the way that we do. This was his way. Saying I would wait from one meal to the next was like saying a kazayit, a kibetza, a tevach. It was his way of saying an amount of time. And those Rishonim have to then figure out, well, what exact amount of time
At what frequency did they eat
exactly,
in the Talmud?
Just like, we want to know what temperature is Yatsoletipo, so what number of hours is the amount of time he was indicating by saying from one meal to the next. And that's where the Rambam, for example, goes in that direction. And he says, Keshe sha'ot. So that's already where the idea of
5 hours in a minute.
Exactly.
Of my father.
Exactly. It's because he says ke, like 6 hours, is where some will say 5.5 or 5 and 31. So it's rubo kikulo. Some will say 5 in a minute. So it's like 6. Others, interestingly, when the Shulchan Aruch, Rav Yosef Cairo Paskins, he takes out the kuf of the Rambam, and he says sheisha, 6 hours flat. And so that's where. So the 6 hours is very clearly based already from the Rambam, who again says like 6 hours. Shulchan Aruch takes out the ki, so it's a full 6 hours. But
and we said that the Ramah at the end said 6 hours or ki?
He says, he talks about 6. To wait 6
he goes to 6. Okay. That makes sense.
I will also point out that I think it's somewhat well known is that a very, very widespread minhag at this point in time is 3 hours, and that does not really seem to have basis in the Rishonim. I've heard people try to suggest, maybe in the short winter days, 3 hours was the amount of time between meals. My personal approach, but again, I could be wrong, is I don't think there is basis. I surmise, but again, this is just my guess, so I could be wrong. I think that where did 3 hours come from? I think it just felt right to people. Yeah. Like, I think 6 just felt like way too long and way too burdensome. Like the idea of waiting nothing, or even to be machmer, wait 1 hour, as the Ramah suggests as a possibility, just felt not from at all. How could you wait that little?
I agree with you. Yes, people felt uncomfortable the idea of washing their mouth out. Yes,
exactly. I really think that is where 3 came from. 6 felt too much. 0 or, just couldn't tail benching, or 1 felt like not good enough. 3 just felt right. You felt like you were sacrificing for God, but it was manageable.
It also, by the way, might reflect the fact that people ate with more frequency starting by like late, I don't know, maybe we could say medieval times and on. I have no idea when 3 hours began, so I'm making that piece up. But there could be an element of frequency of meals here, which shifted also.
Mm-hmm. Again, could be. But I really even just think it just...
Like human intuition.
Yes.
Human intuition.
But what I always say then when students say, well, then do I need to stop doing it? I feel like it's certainly, especially for somebody who's Ashkenaz, I don't feel there's any reason to stop doing it. Meaning, really, you could be just clearing the table, rinsing your mouth, and making a bracha achrona. Even 1 hour is already a chumrah. So 3 for Ashkenazim is already like chumrah upon chumrah. So even if it's not so rooted, but like if that's what your parents do or whatever it is, like I don't think you have to feel that you need to change it, regardless of whether or not it is super rooted or not.
I love this. First of all, I love this also because we don't usually go into the weeds of Halakhic topics in this podcast, so I'm really happy that we did. And I am certain that people will be bringing this to their Shabbat table and like have what to talk about. And I really love that. And I also really like that as this series is sort of, now we're in the 3rd episode of the book of Vayikra, but the series is sort of taking off in terms of its theme. I really like that we started with really like the meat, pun intended, like the meat of the topic of, what are these derivations, what actually is from God or what isn't from God. And I will just have to say that, you've spoken about so many things that you're very passionate about, which is so clear from the way you speak. And one of the things that I'm passionate about is the fact that there really is, while we obviously have tremendous amount of limitations and restrictions in our religious world, there's a tremendous amount of plurality in terms of beliefs, which to me is one of my favorite things about Judaism, meaning you can fall wherever you want on that spectrum of, we spoke about the 2 different fundamental approaches, is everything from God? Are they, humanly derived? And it's true. Do each of them have like real theological ramifications? Do they also have impact on how people experience their mitzvah observance? They really, really do. They deeply do. Mm-hmm. But there's also something there that to me feels always extremely healthy about a religious system that is going to have so many details that to me, sort of the freedom or the wiggle room that we have in terms of how we sort of think about how it's all come to be, for me happens to be one of the most redeeming parts of that system. Some people love the details. Some people, that's where they find their exciting space. And for me, I love it in the sort of plurality of how we can approach this whole topic. So I really love that you brought that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So. Thank you. Yeah. No, and for me, just going back to our first discussion, like the idea of there being this partnership between God and humans in the creation of Torah, to me is something that I feel like very passionate about, and that speaks to me a lot, is that the Lima Torah itself is a way of almost like partnering with God, not just in learning it, but even potentially in being part of the process of even the creation of Torah.
Mamash. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Really, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.